for the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. It's just Glenn and me today. We're a little shorthanded in the sense that we don't have Tom with us, but we do have a guest that we're going to be interviewing, a friend. But let me get things rolling, and then we'll have him introduce himself in a minute. But I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. The church I serve is in the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, in case people wanted to know. And I've written a lot of stuff, and I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I run my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries. I also work for Reflection Ministries under Ken Boa, and I've written somewhere around 10 books myself. So that's me.
All right. Hey, Tim. This is Tim Adams, who's with us. Hey, Tim, we've been wanting to have you on the show for a while now. It's great to have you here today. But why don't you introduce yourself to the podcast audience?
My name is Tim Adams, and I'm the pastor at Harlandale Methodist Church on the south side of San Antonio, Texas. And I've been there just a little over 2 months now. And prior to that, I was a pastor at Resurrection United Methodist Church here in San Antonio. And Harlandale is my fifth pastorate from the beginning of my ministry until now. And I'm also a freelance writer. I've had a lot of articles published in different newspapers and magazines and various topics and issues, mainly about the intersection of faith and culture. And I'm really excited about being here today. Never thought I'd make it, but here I am.
Well, it's great to have you. Yeah, it's great to have you. Well, we've interacted a little bit, through social media over the years, and I know that you're a very culturally conservative guy, and I think for many people that is something that is not associated with Methodism. Can you kind of fill us in a little bit on kind of your own story in terms of your history in Methodism and some of the things that have occurred here in recent days with regard to some splits and some changes and some different things. And then maybe we can do a little, deeper dive into the nature of Wesleyan theology and stuff. But let's just start with your own unique perspective in the Methodist world, being a cultural conservative.
You're exactly right. That is a pretty unique perspective. And if you don't know the history of Methodism, and especially if you don't know what has gone on in the United Methodist Church over the last 50 years, you can be taken aback by it, because especially in the part of the country that I live in, social conservatism and religious conservatism go hand in hand. I have a good friend. Well, you guys know Kipper Crabb.
Yeah.
He's been on the podcast before, and Kipper and I have known each other for a little over 40 years, and he is currently serving at a Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod Church, right outside of Houston, and the pastor is originally from up north, and he constantly bumps into this idea that cultural conservatism and religious conservatism go hand in hand. Not so much even in the Lutheran Church, even in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. That isn't necessarily the case. That's why states like Minnesota tend, even though they're overwhelmingly Lutheran, they tend to vote Democrat in national elections. But anyway, that's just kind of a sidebar. But within Methodism, there's that history of social progressivism, and Methodism really, in a lot of ways, created the first wave of progressivism, even of first wave feminism. At the end of the 19th and early 20th century, there was a lot of controversy about, women being in ministry and having the same authority as men. My great-grandfather was a Methodist circuit rider. And by that, I mean a literal circuit rider. He rode on horseback. and he had a circuit of 4 or 5, sometimes 6 churches that he ministered to at the same time, and went from church to church every week and preached the gospel and baptized children and conducted revivals. He got swept up in the holiness movement of the late 19th century, and also started allowing his wife to preach. And he got booted out of what was then called the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which was one of the forerunners of the UMC. And he ended up joining the Free Methodist Church as a result of being excommunicated from the Methodist Episcopal Church South. But anyway, as I said, social progressivism goes hand in hand. Wesleyanism has always had a strong emphasis on a social witness. One of John Wesley's famous sayings is no personal holiness without societal holiness. And so there is, like I said, that strong strain. Now, over the years, that has become almost exclusively aligned with the platform of the National Democrat Party here in the United States. And you can pretty much look at their national platform and look at the social principles that are voted on at every 4-year annual, not annual conference, general conference of the United Methodist Church. And they are in lockstep with one another. And so as a result, not to get too far ahead of us, but I think you're seeing a lot of that bleed over into this new movement, the Global Methodist Church, which is trying to fashion itself as a denomination to replace the United Methodist Church for disaffected, I guess I would call them, for the most part, biblical conservatives, that remnant that was in the United Methodist Church. But still, there's a lot of that social, political liberalism that bleeds into that. And honestly, I think it affects their theology as well.
Yeah, well, let's take a step back a little bit here and think about the origins of Methodism. But I can see you've got a question there, a comment there, Glenn.
Well, yeah, two things. First of all, my general impression is that the political platform of the Democratic Party is really drawn from Romans 1. So it seems a little bit odd that the church would be going in that direction. But when you actually look at the origins of Methodism, which is I think where Chris is going to go, you pointed out that Wesley was big on the idea of societal holiness. This is characteristic of the entire evangelical revival that Methodism is part of. The idea that that the gospel should affect not only the individual, but then the individual and the church needs to affect the society. And so this idea of social action, which produced tremendous fruit in the 18th century, abolition of slavery and a whole host of other things, it's not surprising that when those obvious gross abuses are dealt with, that they start looking for other things. And that just sort of, I think, opens the door for falling into whatever the current progressive social reform ideas are. I think it just makes sense that the trajectory would go in that direction.
Absolutely. And Chris, not to cut you off, but to kind of piggyback on what Glenn just said, paired with that going on in the 19th century is the fact that the Methodist Church is the largest Protestant body in America by a big margin. The success that Wesleyanism had in sweeping across the frontier because of this ingenious system of multiplication of the circuit that Francis Asbury and Koch came up with here in America. Of course, Wesley modeled that, there in the UK as well. But still, by the end of the 19th century, Methodism was number one, way above even the Baptists. I mean,
Right.
in our contemporary situation, when we think about the largest non-Catholic, Southern Baptists hesitate to call themselves Protestant, but the largest non-Catholic group in America for, most of our memories has been Southern Baptist. But at the turn of the 19th, early 20th century, it was by far the Methodists. And so, in order to kind of keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, they started sending their best and brightest over to Europe to be educated, and as a result, came back with a lot of novel ideas philosophically and theologically, and they paid a heavy price for that. Later on, they're still, I think, still reaping the whirlwind on that. But we can get to that in a minute. So anyway, I just wanted to add to that, along with the political success that they had. There was also, because of the ecclesiological success that they had in the church growth, that was also they became a victim of that success as they sent people off for theological training to Europe and came back with just a lot of crazy ideas.
Again, if I can interrupt, Wesley's real genius was in organization. Yes. He was an absolutely, if you compare him with Whitefield was generally considered the better evangelist of the two, but Wesley was the real genius in terms of organization. And the success, and Asbury and others really picked up on that and ran with it, and they also had a real genius for it. And that's an interesting example of the importance of those organizational skills and institutionalization, ecclesiology, all of those things for church growth. It's an interesting test case when you take a look at the history of that.
There's a book that was written about the history of Methodism in Texas, and the title of that book is Organizing to Beat the Devil. And that's pretty much what they did. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we can think about the name, just Methodism, which demonstrates an interest in structures and patterns and discipline and so forth. Let's go back to the origins of Methodism, because, again, many of our listeners are unfamiliar with Methodism and its history, although most of our listeners are familiar with the Wesleys, but because of the hymnody, Charles and his hymn writing, I think people are familiar with John just because of the connection to Whitefield. So for our audience, that would be the point of entry. But they were students at Oxford together, and they formed a club, the Holy Club.
The Holy Club, yes.
Yeah, so these were guys who were hanging out at Oxford and became an object of ridicule because of their methodical approach to the Christian faith. In other words, they're, reading the scriptures, they're fasting. They're just the things that they did had a methodological character, and so they were derisively called the Methodists. Another thing about them is they were considered enthusiasts. They were interested in the life of the Spirit and a direct personal encounter with God, and that was really a strong stress, both for Whitefield and for the Wesleys. And that, of course, was uncomfortable for the staid Anglican establishment. And so, Wesley was disinvited often. He would go from place to place and would preach and then be told, don't come back. And
exactly.
So he went outside and did some field preaching. Discovered that was a great way to reach people, and so he preached to the miners, the coal miners and others. He was the object of scorn and ridicule even from that part of the social order, but there was a lot of response. And the Wesleys, of course, by today's standards, would be considered about as conservative theologically as you could get. except for the fact that, they were Arminian, but that wasn't necessarily incompatible with a very high view of Scripture. I mean, even an inerrantist view of Scripture. And so the debates had to do with the Ordo Salutis between the Calvinists and the Methodists. And another thing to note is that there was a Calvinist version of Methodism.
Yes, there was, absolutely.
Whitfield, Welsh.
Right, the Welsh, yeah. So Methodism wasn't exclusively Arminian. The methods, sort of like the class meeting, which today we would describe it as a small group.
Small groups.
People, and a lot of accountability, a lot of stress on, making sure that you were growing in grace. Personal holiness was a really huge matter. Sanctification, that sort of. So now, when it comes to Wesley,
Chris,
I think. Go ahead, Glenn.
One other quick note: something that I learned when we were at Oxford on one of our tours. Oxford at this point was almost a sort of finishing school for aristocrats, people with money, and things like that. Mm-hmm. And they basically hung around drinking, playing cards, making connections, things like that. So the Methodism wasn't only about religion. It was about the fact that they were taking their studies seriously. They were attending classes. They were doing their work. They were disciplined in that too. So the Methodism actually also applied to the fact that they were actually getting their education rather than just making connections and drinking.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think too that the social effects amongst the working class and the lower middle class in England really played a role in preventing the French Revolution from spilling over into the British Isles.
Absolutely.
So there have been a lot of people who've given credit to Methodism for keeping and actually preparing the ground, you could say, for the Victorian era that follows, which is, a morally serious period in English and history. So there are a lot of things that we can praise about Methodism and its influence, but I think too there's another thing that's worth noting. You noted, Glenn, that Wesley was good at organization, but he was kind of a slapdash guy when it came to theology. He was known for kind of pulling things together that didn't necessarily go together. So, for example, his approach to justification had a kind of reformed character. From the standpoint of, say, a Calvinist, not reformed enough, but there was still a very strong emphasis on justification by faith. But at the same time, his approach to sanctification had a kind of Roman Catholic character, and that, of course, is kind of oil and waterish, you could say. But people generally don't read the works of Wesley for the theology. They might read it for its devotional character, in terms of helping a person grow spiritually, and in the sense that that's what Wesley was mostly interested in. But in terms of a thoroughly systematic and cohesive, theology, that's not what people go to Wesley for. They go for, his insights on evangelism and reaching people and organizing things and stuff like that. Anyway.
I not to interrupt, but I've always said a much better source for Wesleyan theology are the hymns of Charles Wesley, not necessarily the writings of John Wesley. Now, I had a good friend, Billy Abraham, who just passed away a couple of years ago, and he was probably the leading Methodist theologian still alive. He and Tom, were y'all familiar with Tom Oden?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So Oden was the other kind of big intellectual giant of the conservative movement within Methodism over the last 30 years. But, Billy Abraham had wrote a series of books about the sermons of Wesley and how that you can derive from them probably a deeper theology than he's generally given credit for. But I've always said and that's why over the years there have been periods of time where Charles Wesley's hymns have been heavily edited or
Oh yeah.
removed from the Methodist hymnal,
Oh
especially
really? From the Methodist?
if they mention the blood of Jesus.
Well, I know that Calvinists edit his hymns a bit. So like when I went into the Reform world and I'd hear some hymns like "And Can It Be," I would like, that's not the line I remember. But they would try to bring his him into line with Reform, and it didn't require a great deal of editing. Maybe a change of word here or there.
Yeah.
But yeah, his hymns are great.
Just an observation on that. I have a friend who is an artist who said about alting hymns to adjust the theology. He said that's sort of like looking at a Rembrandt and saying, yeah, you know what? We should touch this up a little bit. This red needs to be a bit more orange. He says, if you don't like the words, write your own.
Right. Well, no one can beat. I consider Wesley's hymns perhaps the most I think rich. Maybe William Cooper's stuff, but Cooper's stuff doesn't have kind of the stirring character of Wesley's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Charles, he just did some great. He was a great lyricist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. And Charles and John both had dramatic. Some people don't want to say they were conversion experiences, but they were definitely giant leaps forward spiritually. Of course, John Wesley has the famous Aldersgate experience,
right.
Where he, there's a lot of backstory to this incident, but he kind of stumbles into a meeting of Moravians on Aldersgate Street in London, and they're beginning a study of the book of Romans. And in preparation for that study, they're reading Luther's introduction to his commentary. And as the introduction to Luther's commentary is being read by this Moravian, John, in his journal later that night, writes that he felt his heart strangely warmed. And that kind of became the battle cry of Methodism right there. You were looking for this experience to have your heart strangely warmed. Well, interestingly enough, Charles had an almost identical experience, not the same circumstances, but almost an identical experience within 1 week of when John had the more famous Aldersgate experience. But it's definitely reflected in his hymn writing. And, if you want to know how much crap is out there today in praise and worship music, just compare it to a Charles Wesley hymn.
Yeah.
And
you'll see.
Right. Well, yeah, the Wesleys, of course, were classically educated, and most people who, create worship music today are barely educated. But I think what I'd like to do is explore this matter of the experience a bit, because I agree with you, Tim. That's more or less kind of the heart of Methodism, is this quest for this kind of experience. Now, I think one of the things, too, in terms of the backstory that might puzzle people who are unfamiliar with the Wesleys is that they grew up in a parsonage.
Right.
Their father was an Anglican minister. So, and they thought of themselves as Christians. I mean, John Wesley went to the United States to serve as a missionary in Georgia, and so, it's hard for people to conceive of that as being something that someone who wasn't a Christian yet could do. And, they were acknowledged as theologically sound. They had been educated, at Oxford. And so they knew their stuff. But this feature that you brought out, this warming of the heart moment at Aldersgate, which I think is just delightful that it happens when it is, the Luther is being read, which again ties in
the intro to Luther.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It ties in this Reformed feature, so there is this kind of,
Yeah.
you know, thing where you can say, there is this way in which Reformed theology, broadly, speaking, including Lutheranism, is influencing the Methodist movement, but it's not the only thing. And I think, are you familiar with Harold Bloom's The American Religion, that book?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So
Sheilaism. Is he the one that, or is
no,
that Robert and Bella, Habits of the
that was
Heart?
Bella. That was
But
Habits of the Heart. Yeah.
the national religion of America is Gnosticism.
Right.
Yes.
But you probably are aware that he blames Wesley
Yes. Oh yeah.
for the.
Yeah.
So
I do
coming
too
out,
in a certain way.
but coming out of Wesleyanism, we can see the holiness movement, and you brought that up.
Yeah.
The camp meeting movement, all the things that were happening in the late 19th century with that, and Pentecostalism. You wouldn't have Pentecostalism if it wasn't for Methodism, the Azusa Street revival and all of that. So, a lot of the American Protestant scene has been really affected powerfully by Methodism. I mean, just take the Salvation Army. That's coming out of the holiness movement. The Church of the Nazarene, the Free Methodists, they're coming out of the holiness movement. So you had a lot of, you got this kind of fascinating history of fractures within Methodism because, a lot of those holiness guys were kicked out of their Methodist churches, as your circuit riding ancestor was. So, and then you have, you brought to the surface this social kind of gospel feature, and then the influence of European theology and how that pulled on Methodism because, Methodism had kind of arrived. It went from being this sort of peripheral group of pariahs that were kicked out of places and were considered questionable to, as you noted, the Goliath, on the scene in the American religious setting, and that's something worth thinking about too. Was it just that Methodism had a great technique that they just completely thrashed the Presbyterians and the other Reformed churches in terms of growth, or were there other features to Methodism that contributed to success? These are things to think about.
My observation there is that there are things about Methodism that suit the American character of that era. You have this idea of the frontier. You have people who are going out there. Actually, pretty much everybody that's coming to America is, in a sense, an adventurer.
Right.
These are people who are leaving comfortable, settled areas in Europe. They're moving to America. Or they're going to a completely new place. Even if they're settling in New York City, it's a completely new place, completely new environment. And then some of them decide to head out west. These are people who have a strong adventurous streak. They've got a can-do attitude and all of that sort of thing. And there's something I suspect about Methodism that really appeals to that kind of a mindset. The Arminian side of it. It's your decision. You need to make this decision. You need to change your life. You need to do all of these things. It's the kind of a spiritual challenge that people who are frontiersmen and so on could very easily find very appealing. I mean, I think that there's something about it that fits the American character of that era.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, when we think about, say, the New England scene, we have obviously a bunch of, Puritans up there who are Reformed. The people that are there are, Jonathan Edwards and other people who have, a very strong Reformed framework to think about the Christian life. But as people come into the United States, they're not necessarily coming with the same set of ideas about Christianity and so forth. And America is this wide open place with lots of possibility. And there's a sense of optimism. And when it comes to some features of Reformed theologies, that's not what comes to mind. Optimism is not what comes to mind. So there's something about the American character that's paradoxical. We owe so much to the New England Puritans, and yet their theology doesn't seem to sort of fit with the kind of westward expansion that we see. And so when we think about Methodism's growth, you can almost look at the map and see, okay, yeah, Methodism never really gets up into New England, but it sweeps across the mid-Atlantic states. It's in the Midwest that it grows tremendously in places like Indiana and Ohio, and down into, as you know, Texas and many places in the South. So that's a big part of the story. So anyway, what I like to kind of get into now, Tim, is more your experience and your take on what's happened recently, and maybe your thoughts on what's in store. I mean, are there reasons for hope? Kind of fill us in.
Well, not to answer the last question first, but the idea of having hope, I guess it depends on which camp you're in. I think the people that have chosen to remain in the United Methodist Church, they have a kind of hope that is really delusional. I mean, anyone who knows anything about the history of mainline denominations in the United States over the last 60 years knows that they have been hemorrhaging membership. Every single one of them, without exception. I got my MDiv from Bright Divinity School at TCU up in Fort Worth. And TCU is originally a school affiliated with the Disciples of Christ. And if you go back about 50 years ago, the Disciples of Christ claimed about 2.5 million members nationwide. Today, their membership's about 600,000.
Wow.
Maybe. And that may be,
right.
I think they're being generous towards themselves by claiming that size constituency. And the same thing is true of all of them. And so for them to pretend like the future is going to be anything other than a long extended series of train wrecks, they're just not paying attention. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Now, the people who have left the United Methodist Church, so altogether nationwide, you look at it today, the count is about 9,000 churches nationwide that have chosen to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. And of those churches that have disaffiliated, about 4,000 of them have joined the GMC, or the Global Methodist Church. Well, what that means is that over 50% of the churches that have left have either joined another group. Some have joined the Free Methodists, and there are some other smaller groups. But there are a surprising number of churches, like the one I'm currently serving, Harlandale Methodist here in San Antonio, that for right now has chosen to remain independent. Now, is that going to be a long-term commitment? I really have no idea. I'm 63. I'd like to hang around for 10 or 15 years if they'll let me, and serve the church, and hopefully bring in a young guy and mentor and develop him in order to hand the baton off, which is not a very Methodist idea. But, there's a lot of things, that I've learned over the years that, that it was obvious, the Methodists just didn't do it the best way. John Wesley had this principle that he called plundering the Egyptians. And if the Egyptians had a good idea, run with it. And so if the Egyptians are reformed, or, if they're Baptist or whatever they are, there's nothing wrong in my mind borrowing, different methodologies and things in order to reach people. So anyway, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this new group. Obviously, the Global Methodist Church is the largest entity to come out of this current schism within Methodism. Now, this is not the first time this has happened. We alluded to one of them, the fundamentalist modernist controversy at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, and the inroads that progressivism made into the church. And as a result, you did have big groups under the banner of the Holiness movement or the Pentecostal movement and other movements like that exited out of the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church, backing up a little bit more, going back to right before the Civil War, 1844, it divided into northern churches and southern churches, just like most of the major Protestant groups did. That's where the Southern Baptist Convention came from. In 1845, they divided over the issue of slavery into a southern church and a northern church. Well, the Methodists beat them by 1 year. They did it in 1844.
Yeah.
And so from 1844 to 1939, you had the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Then in 1939, there was a reunification of the northern and southern churches that had divided prior to the Civil War, and it just simply became the Methodist Church. Then in 1968, there was a very small Wesleyan group called the United Brethren that was about to go out of business. And so they united with or joined the Methodist Church. And in 1968, the name was changed to the United Methodist Church to incorporate the heritage of the United Brethren, which was another group that could trace its ancestry directly back to Wesley. But from the time the United Methodist Church came to be in 1968, the very next General Conference in 1972, homosexuality, the normalization of homosexuality was on the ballot. And that was, I believe, a direct result of two things. The emergence of gay liberation because of Stonewall in 1969, but also the elimination of homosexuality as a mental disorder from the DSM. That happened in 1970. A purely political move that was carried out by a group of basically homosexual psychiatrists and psychologists that had a lot of political clout within the APA, and they pulled that off and they got homosexuality. And so on the heels of that, in 1972, that was when the United Methodist Church began fighting about normalizing homosexuality and allowing homosexuals to be ordained as ministers, bishops, and have leadership in the church. And that carried through, to the present day, and that's why you see the current division. But it took them 54 years. That's a lot of wasted energy. That's a lot of wasted money. In that time, there were basically three conservative movements that rose up. The first one was called the Confessing Movement within the United Methodist Church. It was primarily academics and intellectuals. The Confessing Movement was. Then you had more of a grassroots laypersons movement called Good News. And Good News was very well organized and published a monthly journal and provided lots of good information and held the liberals' feet to the fire. Then, probably 7 or 8 years ago, a new group called the Wesleyan Covenant Association emerged. And the WCA, the Wesleyan Covenant Association, they are the group that gave birth to the GMC, the Global Methodist Church. They are a direct result, and the Wesleyan Covenant Association has worked very closely with what's left of the confessing movement. There's really not much left of it, and Good News. Good News still publishes their journal. The WCA has their own journal called Firebrand that they publish as well. But anyway,
let's talk a little bit about these movements, these renewal movements. So I'm actually familiar with the Good News movement. When I was a Nazarene pastor on Cape Cod, the guy that was the head of the Good News movement attended my church. Trying to remember his name. I think it was Russ. But anyway.
I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about that?
He was a good guy.
He attended a Nazarene church?
Yeah, he just couldn't stomach the United Methodist on Cape Cod. So they had retired to Cape Cod, and so they came to my church instead. And we got along great. But he eventually left the Cape to, I guess, pastor a church after he was retired somewhere in the Midwest. So I don't know how that all played out. But I guess the thing I'm interested in exploring is the efforts of renewal movements in mainline denominations who are trying to resist the zeitgeist, trying to resist these liberalizing trends, these progressivist trends, particularly with homosexuality. It's interesting. I think homosexuality is just one of those things that people you can't be on two sides of it. It's either you are mainstreaming this perversion, or you are rejecting it. You can't have it both ways.
Right.
So there's, you can maybe play a little game with, say, women's ordination and say, okay, we're not going to do that in our church, but you can do that in your church, that kind of thing. And some denominations, try to manage that. But there's something about the very sort of character of homosexuality that disrupts the household sort of patterns that historically Christianity is supported and relied upon. Things like having children naturally, things like that. So let's think a little bit about these efforts. So you've witnessed this from the inside. So how long have you been a ordained Methodist minister? How far back does that go?
Back to the early '90s was when I went through licensing school.
Okay,
so
you've been there a while,
right? Now I haven't exclusively served Methodist churches in that time. At one point, I was basically a self-supporting urban missionary. I did a lot of the same kind of work that you did
right.
when you were still in the Church of the Nazarene. As a matter of fact, you and I communicated. You wrote this book about it. It had a cat in the title. Something about. Anyway, it was a book about urban ministry.
Okay,
and pretty good sized book actually. And I was a kind of a protege of. Did you ever know Bob Lupton?
Oh, sure.
With the Christian Community Development Association, I was involved in all that stuff. And so for about 10 years, I did that on my own.
Oh, I know the book you're talking about. It was written by Doug Hall up in Boston.
There you go.
The Cat and the Toaster, I think it was.
There you go. So you and I, but didn't you edit that or have a contribution to it, or?
Yeah, I was involved with that. Yeah.
Okay, well, you and I, for some reason, you and I ended up talking on the phone.
Okay.
15 years ago.
Okay.
about that book for some reason. But anyway, so I did that kind of work. I unfortunately, I'm divorced and went through a really painful divorce over, my wife just did not want to have anything to do with ministry anymore. And
Oh,
so
wow,
for a
that's too
time, I
bad.
stepped away from the pulpit. Like I said, I still did ministry, but not in a strict local church context. But when I did go back to doing local church as a pastor of a church again, I went back to a Methodist church because that's where
Gotcha.
my connections were. Now I knew all of this division that was all looming on the horizon, 7 or 8 years ago,
Sure.
when I went back to pulpit ministry. So, I knew I never imagined it was going to play out the way that it did, but nobody saw COVID coming either. And COVID
Yeah.
had a huge impact on this because
Okay. That's
originally what happened was there was a special called general conference that took place in 2019. Normally, the general conference happens every 4 years. So there was a general conference in 2016. So the normal schedule would be 2020 for the next quadrennial. Because of the uproar in 2016 over human sexuality, they had a special called single item agenda general conference only to deal with the question of human sexuality. And it was a straight up and down vote on that issue, whether or not to change the language in the discipline, whether or not to allow the ordination of homosexuals. I mean, everything was on the table. And the conservatives won 53 to 47%.
wow.
Now, the reason they won, 70% of the churches in the United States are liberal, but in the South, they're predominantly conservative. So my takeaway from that was God has a great sense of humor, because what he did was he took a coalition of African and Filipino bishops and Southern rednecks and beat the liberals.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well, that's it.
and that's essentially what happened. But
Right.
the liberals, as they always do, because they can't build anything, they don't know how to build anything. They're parasitic. They're leeches.
Right.
They dug their heels in deeper, and all they did was plan even harder for 2020. Well, then COVID came on the horizon, but before COVID came about, there was a meeting convened in Washington, and it had 16 representatives from that supposedly represented every nuance of the United Methodist Church. So I guess there are 16 different variations of United Methodism, from ultra conservative to ultra uber liberal. And anyway, they convened this group of people, and a Jewish lawyer, obviously not Methodist, a secular Jewish lawyer, got this group of people together, and they worked out what was called the Protocol for Grace and Separation. And it was an amazing deal that they worked out. And under that deal, a thing called the trust clause. The trust clause is simply this, and that is that all property owned by the local church is held in trust by the conference. So the local church doesn't own anything. In the United Methodist system, a local church doesn't even own their own hymnals. They don't own the property. They pay for everything,
Sure.
but they don't own anything. And so this agreement for separation, it did away with the trust clause. It put $25 million into a startup fund for whatever this new denomination was going to be. So they would get $25 million from the United Methodist coffers to start this new entity. And also, any church that wanted to leave could leave, and all they had to do was take a vote. They didn't have to pay anything. There were no exit fees involved.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to know my opinion, if that protocol would have stayed in place, and if it would have been voted on in 2020 and passed, I think 3 times as many churches would have left in the United States. Because the way the system worked out in the United States, in order to be able to leave the United Methodist Church, you had to pay your yearly apportionments, and apportionments are basically taxes that the local church, a percentage of your gross receipts for the year, you pay a percentage of that, 15 to 20%, you pay that back to the conference. That's how they operate. That's where they get their money. And so you have to pay 2 years worth of apportionments and any unsecured pension liabilities. And basically what that means is whatever is owed for pension contributions for any ordained clergy that you have on staff for the next 2 years. And so, even a small church like where I was at Resurrection, before I went to Harlandale, even a small church like that, they would end up paying about $20,000 to $25,000 out of pocket. Plus, they had to go through a 6-month discernment process, and at the end of the 6-month discernment process, take a vote, and the vote had to be at least 2/3 of the eligible voting congregation, eligible membership that voted. At least 2/3 of them had to be in favor of disaffiliation. So it was a lot more hoops to jump through, and money had to be paid. But under the protocol thing, it was a sweetheart of a deal. Well, when COVID started, that went away. It never happened, and it completely evaporated. So anyway, that's a little more backstory there.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, then your comment concerning how many did leave, it was 9,000 congregations. So 9,000 congregations left, and then of those, say 4,000 formed this new denomination, the Global Methodist Church. But how many churches remain in the United Methodist denomination now, roughly?
So in the United States, prior to the disaffiliation process beginning in earnest, I believe the number was at around 55,000 total congregations, somewhere around there.
Okay. So there's still a fairly significant number that are still associated with the United Methodist Church today.
Yeah, exactly. What I take that back. Not 55,000. I'm thinking about the Southern Baptists. They're the ones that have that larger. The United Methodists probably had about 40,000, something like that.
Still pretty good. I mean, so about 2/3 to 3/4 remained.
Exactly. Right.
Now, when it comes to the future of these two groups, well, you could say three groups. You've got, the United Methodist Church, you've got the Global Methodist, and then you have the unaffiliated. What's your take on the prospects for United Methodism? So it seems as though the progressives have swept the table and now have an even stronger hold on that group.
Yeah, there's virtually no conservative remnant. Now, there are some people who, kind of like in the Episcopal Church, you have people in the Episcopal Church that call themselves continuing Episcopalians, who are still Orthodox, but have chosen to remain in that denomination, even though it's completely capitulated to progressivism. And from what I hear, there's a small group within the United Methodist Church that have kind of taken that label as well, or a similar name for themselves, where they are still, conservative. They say they're conservative theologically, but they're going to remain in the United Methodist Church as kind of an alternative for people who want to remain United Methodist but are still conservative themselves. But the United Methodist Church, oh, good grief. If you look what they've done when all of these things were supposed to be against the rules, I mean, the discipline up until this most recent General Conference in 2024, when they finally took that language out that clearly stated that homosexuality is incompatible with biblical teaching and church doctrine. and that no self-avowed practicing homosexual would be allowed to be ordained or hold a position of leadership in the United Methodist Church. I mean, it was as clear as it could be. And even with that strong language in there, up until a few months ago, they still ordained gay bishops out in the Western conferences.
Right.
Even here in Texas, in my conference, which was kind of middle of the road, probably. I was in my former conference was the Rio, Texas conference, which is basically South Texas. And, pretty much, like I say, middle of the road for the most part. But we had 3 or 4 known practicing gay clergy who were appointed to local churches, and it was an open secret, common knowledge, and no one did anything about it.
Well, that's the thing I think to keep in mind, that even when you have the language in place, that's not sufficient. You've got to have the wherewithal, the courage, the support that's required in order to actually apply the discipline. It's not just enough to say these things are on the books. And I guess the thought I'd like to explore with you as we close here, Tim, is when you think about the renewal movements over those years, was it all a waste of time? Would it have been better for people to just jump ship early and do something else? Or was there something worthwhile about, say, the Good News movement and the fact that for years, they provided a haven for people and they held out hope that maybe they could turn the tide and all that?
Well, the bottom line is this. First and foremost, the lay people who were paying attention voted with their feet a long time ago.
Yeah.
And you look at the typical United Methodist Church, even say a church that has a new church start that starts out in a suburban area, and you look at the type of people that they attract. Very, very few professions of faith.
Mm-hmm.
So very little actual evangelism being done. But by and large, mostly transfer from other denominations, or if it's a conservative church, a conservative United Methodist Church, transfers from liberal United Methodist Church, or they were, let's say they were a family, they were at a United Methodist Church for 20 years, and they were appointed a new pastor, and the pastor's a liberal. So you'd have an exodus of people from that church, and they would go to the nearest conservative church. And that's all very well documented. And so of all the mainline denominations, the United Methodists lost the least number of members, but I think that's because they did a fairly good job of kind of advertising or representing themselves as kind of a middle of the road. Hey, if the husband grew up Roman Catholic and the wife grew up Baptist, come to the Methodist Church. We're kind of a little bit of both.
Right,
I mean, here in San Antonio, that's 75% Roman Catholic. The city is, that's a very, very common story, because you have, one spouse was Roman Catholic, the other spouse was Baptist or some evangelical type group, and they got married, and the Methodist Church was a good place for them to land. And so I think, especially this new group, Global Methodist Church, if they're going to really and truly grow, then they're going to have to really and truly learn how to do evangelism. I mean, that's what everyone has to do. And not just that, but also really understanding the value of, the Christian home, understanding the true value of the baptismal covenant, and what that means and what that should look like, and read your books about the cosmos, the household and the battle for the cosmos.
The War for the Cosmos, sure,
and the
sure.
War for
Yeah,
the Cosmos. There you go.
yeah, yeah. I'm happy to have some Wesleyans
And
read that.
Man of
That'd
the
be great.
House, and but seriously, to take that double pronged approach, to take it seriously, that the kids that are raised in our church will be Christians, and the people that we go out and into the highways and byways and compel them to come in, we're going to reach people that way as well. And as a result, we're going to be a denomination that isn't just a lot of retreads,
Right.
because that's really all the United Methodist Church has been for the longest time.
Yeah.
Golly, I wish we had enough time to get into the whole thing about the Methodist quadrilateral and what a myth that is, but
Well,
maybe
maybe
some
that's
other time.
yeah, that could be a theme for another show. But anyway, thanks for your time, Tim. I mean, you've given us a lot to reflect on. I think that part of the story, as I'm, sort of digesting what you said, is that there's a kind of institutional inertia that kicks in at a certain point when you're successful, and then you kind of plateau, and then you become fixated on sort of the internal kind of political bureaucratic dynamics of your institution, and things just fracture as you kind of settle into a comfortable, sort of respectability. And what happened with Methodism is, in its early days, it was not respectable, grew like crazy, got respectable, decided to pursue, the kind of the status that now it could aspire to have, by getting, connections to theological institutions in other parts of the world, and having the ministers trained by these prestigious European, universities. But the seeds of modernism and liberalism are sown through the process, and then the next thing you know, you've got this really cancerous progressivism that takes over. And I think it's something, like you noted, been experienced across the board with mainline denominations. But increasingly, I think groups that we consider evangelical churches are dealing with the same dynamics. I was just at a conference here that was addressing kind of the state of evangelicalism, and one of the things that was discussed, or topic that was discussed, or a person who was discussed was J.I. Packer. And Packer, of course, was an Anglican, and he was encouraged to leave Anglicanism back in the 60s, early 70s, and he was given the encouragement to write some theological works that could become a real source of enrichment to the large evangelical movement. But he insisted on staying in Anglicanism and fought for Anglicanism on the conservative side, but eventually left finally in 2008. So all those years that he had invested in trying to save Anglicanism didn't produce any fruit, and he lost those years that he could have dedicated to writing some other things. So this is the kind of thing I think that a lot of people are wrestling with. Even in places like the Southern Baptist Convention or the PCA.
Yep.
What do we do? How do we think about these denominations? Have they reached a tipping point? Are we sort of just in the early phases of a process that we already saw play out in the United Methodist Church or the Episcopal Church? Who knows? I think that's what a lot of people are wrestling with. And so having you on to tell the story of Methodism, it gives us a lot of food for thought.
And one other thing I'd throw in there, and this is primarily with the Global Methodist Church, which is, by far the largest single entity that's come out of the current split, and that is my personal belief, and this is like I say, my personal belief, and that is they have not gone far enough. In other words, in terms of being a genuine reform or reformation movement within the Methodist Church, and for example, asking themselves the question about women's ordination,
Right.
Because honestly, what they have done with that, they've drawn a line in the sand on that issue. And if you
Yeah.
are not in favor 100% of women's ordination, then you need not apply.
Yeah, and I think we
And,
see the same dynamic with the Anglican Church, with the ACNA. We see
yep,
that with certain breakaway groups from the PCUSA, who are repelled by homosexuality, but fail to see women's ordination as the wedge issue that opens up a
it's the
church
same
to
hermeneutic
it is
that's used for
that.
women's ordination as justifying or normalizing homosexuality.
And that's the
And
thing that people don't want to accept. This new Methodist denomination or the ACNA or some of the breakaway churches that came out of the PCUSA. But I think that's a great point, and we should probably wrap it up. We've gotten to a place where we should
okay,
kind of bring this to a close. But anyway, thanks a lot, Tim, for your time with us. Anything you want to say, Glenn, as we wrap up? I don't want to leave you without a final word.
Yeah, just I was comparing this with what I had learned about the UCC when I was in Connecticut and working with a church that was trying to escape the UCC and actually succeeded. And the dynamic was very similar, except much earlier and in a lot of ways even sleazier.
Yeah. UCC, Unitarians Considering Christ, the joke
Right.
back in.
and just for the record, what I'm drinking here, this is it's an imperial stout.
All right, great.
Called Bomb, and it's made by Prairie Artisan Ales out of Oklahoma.
Okay.
And if you can ever, I don't know if they sell it up in your neck of the woods. I know y'all are kind of opposite coasts, but it is the nectar of the gods. But it's an imperial stout with a little hint of cocoa, and it is divine.
All right. Well, we'll keep our eyes out for it. When we're down in that part of the world, I don't recognize any of it. But anyway, let's call it a show. Thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We appreciate the fact that you've gotten all the way to the end of this episode. And if you like what you've heard, we encourage you to listen to other shows if you're new to our program. We also encourage you to check out our Patreon page, where people who support the show can make a monthly gift to the show. That does pay the bills. It's a thing that we really think is great, and we depend on, and we hope that you'll consider doing that. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.